Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Ellsworth County, Kansas. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1889, and the western frontier was still being tamed. The vast, windswept prairies of Kansas stretched like an ocean of grass beneath an endless sky. To the casual traveler passing through Ellsworth County, the Blackwell Ranch might have seemed like any other homestead, a modest two-story wooden structure standing defiant against the elements, surrounded by cattle grazing on seemingly boundless land. But locals knew to avoid the narrow dirt path that led to that particular property, especially as dusk settled over the plains. The Blackwell family had arrived in Kansas in 1878, having traveled from Virginia with promises of affordable land and new beginnings. Thomas Blackwell, a stern-faced man with weather-beaten skin and calloused hands, had purchased 320 acres of prairie land, determined to build a cattle empire. His wife, Eleanor, a woman of quiet disposition and watchful eyes, kept to herself, rarely venturing into town. Their two adult daughters, Abigail and Ruth, were known in Ellsworth primarily through whispers and speculation. What brought attention to the isolated Blackwell Ranch was not what happened there, but rather what happened to those who visited. Between 1886 and 1889, county records show that 17 men, primarily cattle buyers, traveling salesmen, and drifters passing through the area, were reported missing after last being seen heading in the direction of the Blackwell property. Yet no formal investigation was ever launched. The local sheriff, Martin Davenport, maintained that men frequently disappeared in the West, seeking new opportunities or escaping old troubles. It wasn't until October 3, 1889, when a Wells Fargo stagecoach driver named James Sullivan made a disturbing discovery that the truth about the Blackwell family began to surface. What he found in a dried-up creek bed approximately 2 miles from the ranch would lead to one of the most disturbing investigations in Kansas history, one that would eventually be deliberately obscured from official records. The summer of 1889 had been unusually harsh across the Kansas prairie. Rainfall had been scarce since late May, causing crops to wither and water sources to diminish alarmingly. By early October, many of the smaller creeks and streams that veined through Ellsworth County had dried completely, leaving only cracked mud and exposed stone where water had once flowed. For most local farmers and ranchers, this drought meant hardship and the prospect of a lean winter ahead. For the Blackwell family, it meant exposure. The Blackwell Ranch sat approximately 12 miles northeast of Ellsworth, Kansas, positioned between two low hills that shielded it from view until travelers were nearly upon it. The main house faced east, toward the rising sun, with a barn and several outbuildings arranged in a rough semicircle behind it. A narrow creek, which local indigenous peoples had named Whispering Water, ran along the northern edge of the property. During the spring months, it flowed generously, but by late summer, it typically dried to little more than a muddy trickle. The ranch itself was notable for its isolation, even in a region where homesteads were often miles apart. The Blackwells had deliberately chosen land that sat away from the main trails and roads, accessible only by a winding dirt path that Thomas had carefully maintained just well enough to allow wagon passage, but not well enough to encourage casual visitors. The closest neighboring ranch was over 5 miles away, owned by the Wilkins family, who reported hearing occasional strange sounds carrying across the prairie at night, sounds they attributed to coyotes or other wildlife rather than their reclusive neighbors. The town of Ellsworth itself had developed around the Kansas Pacific Railway, becoming a significant shipping point for Texas cattle. By 1889, it had settled somewhat from its wilder days, though it maintained the characteristic tension of frontier settlements, a place where civilization and wilderness existed in uneasy proximity. The county courthouse, a 2-story brick building, stood as a symbol of order amid the saloons and general stores that lined the main street. When the Blackwells first arrived in 1878, they attracted little attention beyond the usual curiosity directed at newcomers. Thomas presented himself as a former rancher from Virginia, looking to expand his operations in the more affordable Western territories. He paid cash for his land, an unusual circumstance that raised few questions in a frontier economy, often short on currency. The family arrived with 2 wagons of possessions, including furniture, farming implements, and a small herd of cattle that Thomas claimed represented the start of his breeding stock. Eleanor Blackwell, approximately 40 years old when they arrived, was described in contemporary accounts as a woman of severe aspect with piercing eyes and few words. She participated minimally in community affairs, attending church services occasionally during their first year, but eventually ceasing even this limited social interaction. When addressed directly, she would respond with precise economical phrases delivered in a soft voice that nonetheless commanded attention. The daughters, Abigail and Ruth, presented an unsettling contrast, even in their few public appearances. Abigail, 32 when they arrived in Kansas, carried herself with rigid formality, her movements described as mechanical, like a clockwork doll, by one observer. Ruth, 30 years old, exhibited an unsettling intensity, particularly when examining others. A clerk at the general store once commented that she looks at you like she's memorizing every detail, not for friendship, but for some cold purpose of her own. Before the discovery that would eventually expose the truth, the Blackwell family maintained a careful distance from town life. Thomas would appear monthly to sell cattle or purchase supplies, conducting his business efficiently and without unnecessary conversation. Eleanor was seen perhaps twice yearly, sitting rigidly in their wagon, while Thomas attended to their affairs. The daughters were glimpsed so rarely that rumors circulated about their actual existence. When asked about his family, Thomas would respond with practiced brevity. They keep to themselves. Women's work needs doing at home. This explanation satisfied most in a time and place where privacy was respected and family matters were considered strictly personal. What few noticed was how Thomas's eyes never quite met those of his questioners, and how his right hand would unconsciously move to the hunting knife he kept sheathed at his belt. The routine at the Blackwell Ranch adhered to the natural rhythms of ranch life. Thomas would rise before dawn to tend to the cattle, often not returning until dusk painted the prairie in shades of orange and purple. Eleanor maintained the household with methodical precision, her movements described by a former servant as mechanical, like she was remembering how to appear human with each step. The servant, Margaret Wilson, had lasted only 3 weeks in the Blackwell household in 1882 before fleeing in the night, refusing to explain her departure except to say, "Some houses ain't meant to be lived in by decent folk." The daughters, Abigail and Ruth, had their own routines, though these were largely hidden from outside observation. According to sparse accounts, Abigail handled the vegetable garden and poultry, while Ruth tended to dairy production. Both were said to be accomplished at preserving foods, particularly meat, with Thomas once mentioning with uncharacteristic pride that Ruth could keep beef fresh longer than any butcher in Kansas. The Blackwell cattle operation, while modest in comparison to the larger ranches in the region, was remarkably profitable. Thomas sold fewer animals than his neighbors, but commanded higher prices, claiming his specialized feeding and breeding practices produced superior meat. He maintained a small but steady clientele of buyers from Kansas City and occasionally St. Louis, who would travel specifically to the Blackwell Ranch to select animals. Curiously, these buyers never seemed to return for a second visit. When this pattern was later examined, investigators discovered that each buyer was replaced within 6 months by a new representative from the same company, with correspondence indicating the previous agent had moved on to other opportunities or decided to explore different territories. What remained unspoken was how travelers would occasionally seek shelter at the ranch, particularly during harsh weather or when night caught them far from town. The Blackwells, despite their reputation for reclusiveness, were known to offer basic hospitality, a meal, water for horses, and sometimes lodging in the barn. It was this seemingly generous practice that would later take on a more sinister aspect as investigations proceeded. The discovery that would eventually expose the Blackwell family came through pure chance, the intersection of unusual weather conditions and a mail carrier's decision to take a shortcut. The weather during the summer of 1889 had been particularly harsh, with drought conditions prevailing across much of Kansas. By September, the creek on the Blackwell property had dried completely, exposing a bed of cracked mud and stones. It was in this dried creek bed that James Sullivan, taking a shortcut while delivering mail to outlying farms, noticed something reflecting sunlight among the stones. Sullivan, a 36-year-old former cavalry soldier who had taken up mail delivery after his military service, was known for his attention to detail and methodical habits. These qualities had served him well in establishing efficient routes through the county's challenging terrain. On October 3, 1889, running behind schedule due to a broken wagon wheel earlier in the day, Sullivan decided to cut across a stretch of open prairie rather than following the established trail, bringing him to the dried creek bed approximately 2 miles southeast of the Blackwell property. Upon closer inspection, Sullivan discovered a pocket watch, its silver case tarnished but still intact. Opening it revealed an inscription, "To Harold from Elizabeth, June 12, 1885. Sullivan recognized the name. Harold Matthews had been a livestock buyer from Topeka who had disappeared in the area nearly a year earlier. His horse had eventually wandered into Ellsworth, saddlebags empty, but the man himself had never been found. Matthews' disappearance had caused some concern at the time, particularly among the commercial community in Ellsworth. As a representative of a significant meat-packing operation in Topeka, his absence disrupted established business relationships. Sheriff Davenport had conducted what he termed a thorough investigation, which amounted to questioning a few saloon patrons and sending telegrams to neighboring counties. When these efforts yielded no results, the matter was effectively abandoned. Sullivan's discovery might have remained nothing more than an interesting find had he not noticed, approximately 20 yards downstream, what appeared to be a leather boot protruding from the bank where the creek had eroded the soil. What Sullivan uncovered next would fundamentally change the understanding of the Blackwell family and their isolated ranch. The boot contained human remains. Further investigation revealed not one, but 3 bodies buried in shallow graves along the creek bank, exposed only because of the unusually severe erosion caused by the preceding spring's heavy rains followed by the summer drought. All 3 were adult males, and preliminary examination suggested they had been deceased for different periods, ranging from approximately 2 months to over a year. Sullivan, displaying the composure that had served him well during his military service, did not disturb the scene beyond confirming his grim discovery. Marking the location by tying his red bandana to a nearby stunted cottonwood tree, he immediately rode to Ellsworth to alert Sheriff Davenport. The sheriff, a man described in town records as more interested in maintaining peace than pursuing justice, initially seemed reluctant to investigate, suggesting that the bodies might be those of indigenous people or casualties from earlier conflicts. It was only when Sullivan presented the pocket watch and mentioned its connection to Harold Matthews that Davenport reluctantly agreed to assemble a small party to examine the site. Sheriff Martin Davenport, aged 53 in 1889, had held his position for nearly 12 years, having been elected shortly after arriving in Ellsworth County. His background before this arrival remained somewhat vague, with references to law enforcement experience in Missouri that were never fully substantiated. Of medium build with a carefully maintained mustache and a preference for clothing quality above his official salary, Davenport maintained order in Ellsworth with a combination of selective enforcement and strategic relationships with local business owners. The investigation party, consisting of Davenport, Sullivan, the town doctor William Carson, and 2 deputies, arrived at the creek bed around midday on October 4, 1889. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. Dr. Carson's examination, recorded in his personal journal rather than official documents, noted that all three bodies showed evidence of having been exsanguinated prior to burial, drained of blood. More disturbingly, all three had been subjected to what Carson delicately termed partial processing, with certain cuts resembling those used in butchering livestock. Dr. William Carson, 62 years old and the only physician in Ellsworth, had served as county coroner by default for over 15 years. A graduate of a Philadelphia medical college, Carson had practiced in several eastern cities before heading west, ostensibly for his health, but, as local rumor suggested, possibly to escape personal or professional difficulties. Despite occasional bouts of heavy drinking, Carson maintained a reputation for thorough work and precise documentation, keeping detailed records of all his medical and forensic observations in leather-bound journals. These journals, which would later become crucial historical evidence, revealed Carson's growing unease about the Blackwell discovery. In an entry dated October 4, 1889, he wrote, "What we observe today extends beyond the bounds of ordinary human depravity. The precision of the injuries suggests not frenzied violence, but methodical purpose. I find myself questioning whether such actions could be performed by those who maintained even a tenuous connection to humanity as we understand it." Sheriff Davenport made an immediate decision that would later be questioned. Rather than proceeding directly to the Blackwell Ranch, he returned to Ellsworth to organize a larger posse and to telegraph for assistance from the state authorities in Topeka. This delay of nearly 18 hours would later be scrutinized, particularly when it was discovered that Davenport had business dealings with Thomas Blackwell and had purchased cattle from him at suspiciously low prices on several occasions. The official explanation for this delay, as recorded in Davenport's report to state authorities, cited concerns about adequate manpower and the need for proper documentation before confronting the Blackwells. Dr. Carson's private notes suggest a different motivation. D. appeared visibly shaken by our discoveries, not merely with the natural revulsion one would expect, but with what I perceived as personal fear. When S. suggested immediate confrontation with the B family, D. became agitated, insisting on procedural delays that serve no investigative purpose. I cannot help but wonder what relationship exists between the sheriff and that isolated homestead. When the expanded posse, now numbering 12 men, arrived at the Blackwell Ranch on the morning of October 5th, they found the property seemingly abandoned. The front door of the main house stood open, creaking on its hinges in the prairie wind. Inside, they discovered a home meticulously maintained but devoid of personal items. No photographs, letters, or identifying documents remained. The kitchen, however, told a different story. Dr. Carson's documented observations describe a room equipped for purposes beyond mere food preparation. Large metal hooks hung from ceiling beams positioned over a central table with deep drainage channels cut into its surface. A collection of knives and saws, all immaculately clean, were arranged on a nearby counter. In the corner stood a large cast-iron rendering pot, its interior showing evidence of repeated intensive heat. One of the deputies, a man named Robert Franklin, who had worked as a butcher before joining the sheriff's office, noted the professional quality of the tools and arrangements. "Whoever set this up knew their trade," he is recorded as saying. "These aren't the tools of an amateur or someone who happened into this work. Everything is placed for efficiency and thoroughness." The cellar entrance, hidden beneath a rug in the pantry, revealed the most disturbing aspects of the Blackwell operation. Descending the narrow stairs, the investigation party found a cool, dark space that had been expanded well beyond the typical dimensions of a prairie homestead's storage cellar. The room stretched beneath the entire house and extended even further in one direction, with evidence suggesting it continued via tunnel toward the barn. The cellar walls, constructed of fitted stone rather than the more common packed earth, provided effective insulation and sound dampening. Oil lamps hung at regular intervals, illuminating a space that had clearly been designed with specific purposes in mind. The air, despite the nature of the activities conducted there, was surprisingly fresh, suggesting an advanced ventilation system that prevented the buildup of odors that might attract attention. Along one wall stood a row of large ceramic crocks, the kind typically used for pickling or preserving. Many contained meat preserved in brine. While initial assumptions were that this was beef or pork, Dr. Carson's reluctant examination confirmed what some had already feared. The contents were human tissue, prepared and preserved with expert precision. Adjacent to this storage area was a smaller room that appeared to serve as a processing area. Drainage channels had been cut into the packed earth floor, all leading to a central collection point. Later investigation revealed that blood and other fluids would drain into a specially constructed vessel, which could be accessed via a trapdoor in the floor. The vessel, made of copper lined with tin, had been carefully designed to prevent corrosion while maximizing the collection of fluids. Attached to it was a system of rudimentary pumps and filters that suggested the Blackwells were not merely disposing of these fluids, but processing them for some purpose. Several glass bottles, their contents long since removed, bore handwritten labels with dates and cryptic notation such as HM, Prime, and JW, acceptable. What struck many of the investigating party was the methodical, almost industrial nature of the setup. This was not the work of frenzied madness, but rather of calculated, systematic preparation. Everything had been designed for efficiency and discretion. A ventilation system using underground pipes prevented odors from escaping to the outside, and the thick stone walls ensured no sounds would reach beyond the cellar. In the barn, they found further evidence of the operation's scope. False walls concealed storage areas containing personal effects, watches, wallets, clothing, and documents, presumably belonging to the victims. A ledger, later partially deciphered, seemed to catalog acquisitions by date, physical description, and yield. The clinical detachment of these records disturbed investigators as much as the physical evidence. The ledger, bound in leather that forensic examination would later suggest was not of animal origin, contained entries dating back to 1878, the year the Blackwells arrived in Kansas. Each entry followed a consistent format, beginning with a date, a physical description of the subject, and notes on their arrival at the ranch. Subsequent entries tracked processing dates, yield amounts, and distribution information. Most disturbing were the marginal notes evaluating quality, with phrases such as exceptional marbling and tender beyond expectation appearing frequently. By now, word of the discovery had begun to spread, and additional law enforcement personnel were arriving from neighboring counties. A systematic search of the property was undertaken, revealing a total of 24 sets of remains in various stages of decomposition, buried at different locations around the property. The majority were found in the dried creek bed, suggesting the Blackwells used the water flow to help conceal evidence. The victims, all male, ranged in age from approximately 20 to 60 years, based on Dr. Carson's preliminary examinations. They represented a cross-section of frontier society: traveling salesmen identified by remnants of sample cases, cattle buyers carrying company documents, drifters with few identifying possessions, and even 2 law enforcement officers from neighboring counties who had disappeared while investigating reports of cattle theft in the area. Most disturbing to the investigators was the realization that the Blackwell family must have been engaged in this activity for years, potentially since their arrival in Kansas. The sophistication of their operation indicated a practiced methodology that had been refined over time, yet somehow they had maintained a veneer of normalcy sufficient to avoid serious scrutiny. The question that dominated discussions among the investigation team was simple but chilling. Where were the Blackwells? The evidence suggested they had departed in haste, but with preparation. A wagon and 2 horses were missing, along with what appeared to be substantial supplies. Clothing belonging to all family members remained in drawers and wardrobes, suggesting they had taken only what was necessary for travel. Sheriff Davenport organized search parties to explore all possible routes of escape, focusing particularly on paths leading north toward Nebraska or east toward Missouri. Telegraph messages were sent to law enforcement in surrounding states, providing descriptions of the family members and warning of their potentially dangerous nature. In the days that followed, reports of sightings flooded in, most proving false upon investigation. A family matching the Blackwells' description was detained briefly in Topeka, only to be released when it became clear they were legitimate travelers. A man resembling Thomas was reportedly seen boarding a train in Wichita, but witness accounts conflicted regarding his companions and destination. It was a cattle driver named Ezekiel Parker who provided the first credible clue to their whereabouts. Having camped near the Kansas River, approximately 30 miles southeast of Ellsworth, Parker reported seeing a family matching the Blackwells' description, boarding a riverboat in the early morning hours of October 4th, the day after Sullivan's initial discovery. According to Parker, they carried several large trunks and paid the boat captain with gold coins, an unusual form of currency in the cash-poor frontier. Parker's account included details that lent it credibility. He described Thomas's distinctive limp, a result of an old injury that had never properly healed, and noted Eleanor's habit of constantly scanning her surroundings, a behavior remarked upon by others who had encountered her. Most convincingly, he mentioned the younger daughter, Ruth, carrying a specific leather case that investigators had noted was missing from the ranch house, a case known to contain specialized butchering tools. The riverboat, identified as the Prairie Rose, was known to make regular trips between Kansas landing points and eventually connect with larger vessels on the Missouri River. This suggested the Blackwells were attempting to reach St. Louis or possibly continue south along the Mississippi. Authorities in riverports were notified, but the family seemed to have vanished into the growing networks of America's waterways. As the investigation at the ranch continued, more details emerged about the Blackwell family's operation. Interviews with merchants in Ellsworth revealed that Thomas regularly purchased unusual quantities of salt, herbs, and preserving agents, explaining them as necessary for preparing beef for eastern markets. Eleanor occasionally sold preserved meats at regional markets, where her products commanded premium prices for their quality and longevity. One merchant, Samuel Wilson, who operated the general store in Ellsworth, recalled conversations with Thomas regarding preservation techniques. He'd ask peculiar questions about how long certain methods would keep meat palatable, not just weeks or months, but years. He seemed particularly interested in methods used by sailors for long voyages, and once asked if I could order specific chemicals from Eastern suppliers, things I'd never heard of and had to look up in my catalogs. The daughters, Abigail and Ruth, emerged as more central figures than initially assumed. A former ranch hand, who had worked briefly for Thomas in 1884, described them as unnervingly precise in their movements, like they'd practiced every gesture. He recounted observing Ruth preparing meat with the steady hands of a surgeon, while Abigail managed the preservation process with meticulous attention to detail. This ranch hand, Joseph Miller, had left the Blackwell employment after only 2 weeks, claiming the atmosphere at the ranch made him feel more like livestock than help. He described how the family would watch him while he ate meals they prepared, with an attention he found disturbing. They'd stare at how I chewed, how much I ate. Miss Ruth once asked me if I thought I was tender. I was on my horse heading to town before sundown. Miller's testimony, initially dismissed as exaggeration, gained credibility as the investigation uncovered the full scope of the Blackwell operation. Particularly disturbing was his recollection of overhearing a conversation between the sisters regarding what they termed stock assessment, a systematic evaluation of individuals who visited the ranch with discussions of quality, yield potential, and processing requirements. Dr. Carson's examination of the victims revealed patterns that suggested not just murder, but a form of systematic harvesting. The bodies showed evidence of careful exsanguination and specific organ removal prior to further processing. In his private notes, later discovered among his effects after his death in 1902, Carson wrote, "I am forced to conclude that the primary motivation was not mere disposal of murder victims, but rather the deliberate acquisition of human materials for consumption and other purposes." This conclusion was supported by the discovery of a small leather-bound book found concealed behind a loose stone in the cellar wall. Written primarily in Eleanor's neat, precise handwriting, it contained recipes and instructions for the preparation of various cuts and organs. The clinical terminology and detailed methodology suggested not a descent into madness, but a carefully developed expertise. The book, which would later disappear from the evidence collected, contained not just preparation instructions, but also notes on selection criteria. Subjects with diets high in spirits produce inferior results, one entry noted. Another specified that those who engage in significant physical labor yield tougher, but more flavorful portions. Most disturbing were the comparative assessments. Compared to conventional livestock, human yields require more careful aging, but result in superior flavor complexity when properly prepared. Throughout October and into November of 1889, the investigation continued, with state officials eventually taking over from the local authorities. Sheriff Davenport, facing questions about his prior inaction regarding the disappearances, resigned his position and reportedly left Kansas entirely, heading west to Colorado Territory. The investigation into Davenport's potential involvement revealed a pattern of suspicious financial transactions. Bank records showed regular deposits to his account that exceeded his official salary, often coinciding with Thomas Blackwell's visits to town. Additionally, correspondence found at the ranch suggested Davenport had been aware of at least some aspects of the Blackwells' activities, having been paid to redirect inquiries about missing persons and to ensure certain shipments left the county without inspection. By December, with the Blackwells still at large, public interest in the case began to wane, replaced by an unspoken desire to distance the community from the horror discovered in their midst. Newspapers in larger cities continued to run stories about the Kansas Butcher family, but local publications increasingly focused on more positive developments, harvests, railway expansion, and community events. The Blackwell Ranch itself became subject to a curious form of collective avoidance. Although technically held as evidence by the state, the property stood abandoned with no one willing to approach it. Local residents began treating the area as if it simply didn't exist, taking longer routes to avoid passing near it. The community collectively agreed to never mention the Blackwells or their ranch, creating a silence that would eventually calcify into deliberate forgetting. This communal response reflected more than just the natural desire to move beyond tragedy. Contemporary accounts suggest a deeper, more unsettling motivation, the realization that the Blackwell products had circulated widely within the community. Eleanor's preserved meats had been purchased by many local families and served at community gatherings. The possibility that neighbors had unknowingly consumed human flesh created a profound psychological trauma that manifested as collective denial. In March 1890, a promising lead emerged when a woman matching Eleanor Blackwell's description was detained in St. Louis after attempting to sell jewelry identified as belonging to one of the victims. However, before a positive identification could be made, the woman managed to escape custody under circumstances that suggested external assistance. This incident represented the last credible sighting of any Blackwell family member in the official record. The St. Louis incident revealed another disturbing aspect of the case, the suggestion of a wider network supporting the Blackwells' activities. The arresting officer reported that the woman was released following the intervention of a gentleman of significant standing in the business community, who provided documentation purportedly establishing her identity as someone other than Eleanor Blackwell. These documents were later determined to be forgeries, but by then, both the woman and her benefactor had disappeared. As 1890 progressed into 1891, the case gradually transitioned from active investigation to historical infamy. The state authorities, facing budgetary constraints and pressure to address more current concerns, officially classified the case as unresolved pending new evidence in August 1891. The physical evidence, including the ledgers, tools, and preserved remains, was transported to Topeka for storage in state archives. What happened next represents one of the more unusual aspects of the case. In February 1892, a fire broke out in the State Archive building, destroying a significant portion of the stored materials. While officially attributed to faulty wiring, some investigators noted the selective nature of the damage. The Blackwell evidence was completely destroyed, while surrounding materials suffered only smoke damage. The official report on the fire, issued by the Kansas State Fire Marshal, concluded that the blaze originated in the precise section where the Blackwell materials were stored. More suspicious was the timing. The fire occurred the night before a planned review of the evidence by a special committee formed by the governor in response to continuing questions about the case's handling. The committee was particularly interested in examining the ledger that had cataloged distributions, as it potentially contained names of those who had knowingly purchased the Blackwell's products. By 1895, the Blackwell case had been effectively buried, both literally and figuratively. The ranch buildings were demolished by state order, ostensibly for public safety, and the land was reclaimed by the prairie. Local histories written during this period make only passing reference to the family, describing them simply as early settlers who later relocated. The true nature of their activities was deliberately obscured. It would remain this way until 1925, when historian Margaret Fleming, researching frontier justice for her doctoral dissertation, discovered Dr. Carson's private journals among papers donated to the Kansas Historical Society after his death. Fleming's subsequent investigation, conducted despite significant resistance from local and state officials, revealed the extent to which the Blackwell case had been systematically erased from official records. Fleming, a 45-year-old academic with training in both history and early forensic science, approached the Blackwell case with methodological rigor unusual for her time. Her research techniques, documented in her notes, included cross-referencing multiple sources, conducting field investigations of the former ranch site, and applying emerging criminal psychology theories to understand the family's operations. Fleming's work was remarkable, not just for its thoroughness, but for its resistance to the prevailing academic trends of the period, which tended to romanticize frontier history or focus on economic and political developments rather than criminal activities. Her approach, integrating archival research with field investigation and theoretical analysis, established methodologies that would not become common in historical criminology for decades. Fleming's research uncovered evidence suggesting the Blackwells had not been acting in isolation. Correspondence found in Dr. Carson's papers indicated that Thomas had connections with buyers in eastern cities who paid premium prices for the specialty preserved meats the family produced. These connections, which included individuals in positions of significant influence, may explain the curious suppression of the case and the mysterious fire that destroyed the evidence. Perhaps most disturbing was Fleming's discovery of shipping records showing regular deliveries from the Blackwell Ranch to exclusive restaurants and private clubs in Chicago, St. Louis, and even New York. The preserved meats, marketed as exotic Western game, commanded extraordinary prices and were apparently favored for their unique flavor and texture. Whether the consumers knew the true nature of what they were eating remains a matter of speculation. Fleming's investigation also revealed that the Blackwell's Kansas operation represented only one chapter in a longer history. Property records and newspaper accounts from Virginia indicated that a family matching their description operating under the name Thornton, had lived near Roanoke during the 1860s and 1870s. Their departure coincided with a series of disappearances similar to those later observed in Kansas. The timing suggested the family had established their methodology well before arriving on the western frontier. Most significantly, Fleming found indications that the Blackwell daughters had been actively involved in the family business from the beginning. Records from Virginia showed both women had worked in a local butcher shop owned by their father, developing skills that would later be applied to their more sinister enterprise. This suggested that the practices discovered in Kansas represented not a descent into madness, but the continuation of established family traditions. Fleming's work, completed in 1927, was never published in its entirety. Her dissertation committee, citing concerns about historical accuracy and public sensibility, required substantial revisions that effectively neutralized her findings. The complete manuscript, including her primary source documentation, was stored in the university archives, where it remained largely forgotten until 1952. That year, criminologist Dr. James Harrison happened upon Fleming's original manuscript while researching historical patterns of serial murder in the American West. Recognizing the significance of her work, Harrison attempted to locate the primary sources she had cited, only to discover that many had mysteriously disappeared from their respective archives. Dr. Carson's journals, in particular, were no longer where Fleming had found them, with no record of their removal or relocation. Harrison, who had established his reputation studying modern serial killers, was particularly struck by the Blackwell case's deviation from typical patterns. "What we see here is not the work of individuals driven by psychological compulsion," he wrote in his notes, "but rather a family engaged in what they clearly viewed as a business enterprise. The methodical documentation, the careful selection of victims, the commercial distribution of the results. These suggest a horrifying rationality that challenges our understanding of human behavior." Harrison's subsequent investigation, conducted largely without institutional support, led him to several surprising conclusions. Through painstaking cross-referencing of newspaper accounts, personal letters, and local records, he determined that the Blackwell family's activities likely extended back well before their arrival in Kansas. Evidence suggested they had operated in Virginia under a different name, leaving that state shortly after a series of disappearances attracted official attention. More significantly, Harrison found indications that at least some members of the family might have survived long after their disappearance from Kansas. A woman matching Ruth Blackwell's description was recorded as operating a boarding house in New Orleans from 1902 to 1911, catering primarily to transient laborers, men whose disappearances would raise few questions. Similarly, a man bearing strong resemblance to Thomas Blackwell appeared in photographs from a mining community in Colorado around 1898, though no record of him exists after 1901. Perhaps most chillingly, Harrison discovered evidence suggesting that the Blackwells' practices may have continued through subsequent generations. A series of unsolved disappearances in Minnesota between 1915 and 1923 bore methodological similarities to the Kansas cases, including the careful selection of transient victims and the systematic disposal of remains. The proprietors of a local meat processing operation were a married couple named James and Mary Smith, who arrived in the area around 1914 and departed suddenly in 1924, when authorities began investigating the disappearances. Harrison's review of birth records in multiple states led him to hypothesize that Mary Smith was actually related to the Blackwell family, possibly a niece or cousin who had learned their methods. The implications were profound. The Blackwells had not merely escaped justice, but had potentially continued their practices through a new generation, adapting their methods to changing circumstances while maintaining their core activities. Harrison's report, submitted to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1953, received acknowledgment but no apparent action. His subsequent attempts to publish his findings academically were met with resistance similar to that experienced by Fleming. His manuscript, titled Harvesting the Frontier, the Blackwell Family Operations, was rejected by multiple publishers, citing concerns ranging from speculative methodology to potential for public alarm. What Harrison couldn't know was that his report had triggered a classified investigation within federal law enforcement. Documents declassified in 1985 revealed that the FBI maintained a file on the Blackwell case under the designation Operation Butcher, focusing particularly on the possibility of continuing family operations. The investigation remained active until at least 1967, though much of the file remains redacted even now. In 1962, Harrison, now largely discredited in academic circles due to his persistent pursuit of the Blackwell case, made one final contribution to the historical record. Having been diagnosed with terminal cancer, he arranged for his research materials, including copies of now-lost primary documents, to be sealed and deposited with the Library of Congress, with instructions that they remain closed until 1990. His accompanying letter explained, "What I have documented is not merely historical curiosity, but evidence of a continuing threat. The Blackwells were not unique aberrations, but the progenitors of a methodology that I believe continues to the present day." Harrison died in 1963, his warnings largely unheeded. When his sealed documents were opened in 1990, researchers found a meticulously organized collection of evidence supporting his claims about the Blackwell family's activities. More disturbing were the connections he had traced to more recent cases, suggesting a continuity of practice extending well into the 20th century. Among the most compelling pieces of evidence was a series of photographs Harrison had obtained showing distinctive butchering techniques used in multiple cases spanning decades in several states. The consistency of these methods, which involved specific patterns of exsanguination and tissue removal, suggested knowledge transmitted through direct instruction rather than coincidental similarity. Accompanying these photographs was Harrison's detailed analysis demonstrating that the techniques represented refinements of practices first documented at the Blackwell Ranch. The Blackwell case represents more than just a historical curiosity or a particularly gruesome frontier crime. It stands as evidence of how effectively history can be manipulated, uncomfortable truths suppressed, and ongoing threats ignored when they conflict with preferred narratives or implicate the powerful. The site where the Blackwell Ranch once stood remains vacant to this day, the land never reclaimed for agricultural or residential use. Local residents still avoid the area, though few could articulate exactly why. The creek, which once exposed the family's crimes, has long since returned to its natural flow, covering whatever evidence might still remain beneath its waters. Those who have visited the site in recent years report an unusual silence, a quality described not as peaceful but as oppressive, as if the land itself remembers what occurred there. Wildlife avoids the area, with game trails visibly diverting around the former ranch boundaries. Even the prolific prairie grasses grow differently there, creating subtle patterns visible from aerial photographs that outline where structures once stood. In 1968, the last official action related to the Blackwell case occurred when the Kansas Historical Society declined a researcher's request to excavate the former ranch site, citing respect for historical context and limited scholarly value. The researcher, whose name has been redacted from available records, had apparently uncovered shipping manifests suggesting the scale of the Blackwell's operation was substantially larger than previously documented. The manifests, excerpts of which were included in the request, indicated regular shipments of specially prepared provisions to destinations throughout the eastern United States and even to Europe. Most disturbing was the evidence of systematic distribution networks, including coded communications with receivers who clearly understood the true nature of what they were purchasing. These documents suggested not isolated criminal activity, but an organized trade in human remains that operated beneath the veneer of legitimate commerce. Those who have studied the case most thoroughly suggest that its true significance lies not in the gruesome details of the crimes themselves, but in what they reveal about the fragility of historical truth. The systematic erasure of the Blackwell case from official records demonstrates how effectively uncomfortable realities can be obscured, particularly when they challenge fundamental assumptions about civilization's progress on the American frontier. The conventional narrative of Western expansion emphasizes themes of courage, determination, and the triumph of order over chaos. The Blackwell case, with its suggestion of methodical evil operating successfully within supposedly civilized contexts, contradicts this reassuring story. More disturbing is the implication that the family's activities were not merely tolerated, but actively protected by elements of the very institutions meant to ensure public safety. Perhaps most unsettling is the possibility that the Blackwell legacy continues not just as historical footnote, but as ongoing practice. The patterns they established, targeting the vulnerable and transient, processing, remains with clinical efficiency, and distributing the results through seemingly legitimate commercial channels, created a template that would be remarkably difficult to detect, even with modern investigative techniques. Between 1952 and 1967, Harrison documented 7 distinct cases across the United States that exhibited characteristics consistent with the Blackwell methodology. Each involved a family unit or small group operating in relative isolation, selective targeting of victims unlikely to be missed, and evidence of processing human remains for distribution. In each case, investigations were either abandoned prematurely or evidence mysteriously disappeared before prosecutions could proceed. As Dr. Harrison wrote in his final notes, "The ultimate horror of the Blackwell case is not what happened at that isolated ranch in Kansas, but the possibility that similar operations continue to exist, hidden behind veneers of normalcy and protected by our collective unwillingness to acknowledge such possibilities." Modern criminologists reviewing the historical evidence have noted that the Blackwell operation represents an unusual category of criminal enterprise, one combining elements of serial murder with methodical business practices. Unlike typical serial killers who are driven primarily by psychological compulsion, the Blackwells appear to have been motivated by calculated profit and perhaps by traditions passed through generations. This combination of characteristics makes such operations particularly difficult to identify and interdict. They lack the psychological signatures that often lead to the capture of serial offenders, while maintaining a level of discretion that distinguishes them from more visible criminal organizations. As one analyst noted in a 2005 review of the case, the Blackwells weren't just killers, they were entrepreneurs in a horrific market that may still exist in some form today. The wind still blows across the Kansas prairie, whispering through the tall grass that has reclaimed the land where the Blackwell Ranch once stood. The creek still flows, covering secrets beneath its waters. And somewhere, perhaps, the descendants of Abigail and Ruth continue their family traditions, serving more than just water to unsuspecting guests who never leave to tell their tales. Those who travel the back roads of rural America might do well to remember the Blackwell story, not as a sensational tale of frontier horror, but as a reminder that evil often wears the most ordinary faces and offers the most welcoming smiles. The next time a friendly family offers shelter for the night in an isolated location, consider what might be served at dinner and what role you might play in the meal that follows.